let our teachers and our superintendent here and our school board come up with a system that works so the best performing teachers are rewarded, but it's fair, it's not based on a bunch of standards decided in some back room somewhere. That's what has to happen. That's what is happening. And this has happened all across the state because of the race to the top money has incentivized performance pay for teachers. It's happening. Senate Bill 5 says, forget all that, we're taking over, we know best, all of you do this. It just doesn't make much sense, and I think it's one of the areas where they clearly dramatically overreached.
Mr. Greenberg, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I do want to go back for 30 seconds to the safety issue, which is so important. I'd also like you all to take a look at the drug testing provisions in the FOP and the firefighter union contracts and the contracts with SAU and Head Start. All of these contracts say that when an employee tests positive for drugs or alcohol, he's guaranteed to keep his job as long as he goes to counseling. You won't find that kind of rule in most private sector companies. And that's because of the perverse incentive of saying to employees, if you come to work under the influence,
thank you, Mr. Greenberg.
you're going to get a second bite at the apple.
We're out of time. The next question goes first to Mr. Pepper. The Act eliminates the option for parties to submit disputed issues to a mutually agreed upon dispute resolution procedure. In the private sector, dispute resolution procedures are generally favored. What is the reason for this prohibition?
I think I've addressed this a little bit already, but I'll go back into it because I think it's the most important part of the law. I think it's to kill collective bargaining. When this law was first announced in January, February, the headlines were very clear. Law gets rid of collective bargaining. That's what it said. But guess what? People figured out real quick how unpopular that idea was. The polls show it. 2/3 of Americans, most Ohioans, they believe that people should have basic rights to collectively bargain. They believe that. They understand the history and why it's mattered so much. So out of the blue, after that initial pushback, they decided, and Marianne, you used the same wording in the beginning, we won't get rid of collective bargaining. We're going to call it reform. We're going to call it collective bargaining reform because we don't want to be on the side of getting rid of it, knowing just how deeply unpopular that is. But as I described, any process where one of the two sides of the negotiation picks the result if they don't like the discussion isn't bargaining at all. It's begging. You're requiring one side to beg and the other has all the cards. So to say there's collective bargaining, and by the way, the Issue 2 campaign, they really insist on saying, this does not get rid of collective bargaining. Read their material. The law is the same. It's not. The process is meaningless. It's a facade. Every issue you bring up is subject to a process where at the end of the day, if there's not an agreement, one side picks the outcome. You know, Gary, we tossed a coin in the back about who got to go first. Imagine if I said, no, I don't like the result. I want the other side. You won the toss. I mean, that was a fair process. But under this process, it's heads I win, tails you lose. That's what it is. So I think the purpose is to honestly get rid of any collective bargaining, but still be able to say we're reforming and not getting rid of it, knowing just how unpopular getting rid of it outright would be.
Mr. Greenberg?
It's so important that you all understand the current system. Let me make it simple. We're at the bargaining table. I represent the city. The city proposes a 1% increase to the police department. The FOP asks for 3%. 1%, 3%, we can't agree. What happens then? This neutral arbitrator who lives 300 miles away and who we'll never see again is called in, and he picks one or the other, 1% or 3%. And the city government, city manager says 3%. Well, if we're going to have to give the FOP 3%, we're going to have to lay off our school nurses. We're going to have to close our schools. We're going to have to close our swimming pools in the summer. Well, there's no choice, no recourse. I can't appeal that 3% to court. We can't refuse to give it. It's over and done with. You, the taxpayers, have nothing to say about it. It's your money. It's your resources. But because the FOP says they want 3% and they get some arbitrator to agree, it's over and done with. That is not democracy. As far as how things are done in the private sector, there is no private sector union contract that says if we can't agree on what the next contract's going to say, some arbitrator's going to decide. And by the way, it's the same thing in the federal government. Federal government employees collectively bargain, but they don't have the right to strike, and they don't have the right to pick a neutral arbitrator to decide what their wages and benefits will be. Guess who makes the final decision in the federal government? Congress and a panel appointed by the president. Okay? Be very interested to know that all these politicians running around here in the state saying how terrible this reform is, like Senator Brown, I'd like to know if he's going to introduce a bill in the Senate that gives to federal employees the right to strike, or to have neutral arbitrators decide what their wages and benefits are going to be. That's not going to happen. People would say that's crazy. We can't run a federal government that way. Well, we can't or we shouldn't run a state and city government that way or a school district that way either. The elected representative should make the final decision.
Mr. Pepper, 30 seconds.
I like when they cite the federal government. It's a real model of fiscal discipline under that system. In the last 2 years, there were 4,400 negotiations. 85 of them, 2%, went to the arbitration process. Every other one was resolved through the negotiation table. And of the 2% that went to that, 50% of the results were in favor of the management, and 50% of the results were in favor of the employees. So this bogeyman that, oh my gosh, this terrible, awful thing is happening, it's a tiny fraction of the cases, and the decisions go more or less either way.
Thank you, Mr. Pepper. Our next question goes first to Mr. Greenberg. Generally speaking, the Act prohibits strikes. Discuss why you think this is or is not a good idea.
Well, it's absolutely a good idea, and rather than explain it myself, I'm going to read a quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR was the president who gave unions their legal power in the private sector in the 1930s in the Wagner Act, but he was absolutely opposed to government employee unionism. In 1937, 2 years after he signed the Wagner Act, he said the following.